Hello and welcome to the Recruit Rockstars podcast, where we focus on the people part of your VC and private equity backed company. I'm your host, Jeff Heitzmann. Every Tuesday and Thursday, I interview a world-class expert on talent and recruiting so that you can build a company filled with rock stars. And one of the thrills, one of the joys of leading this show is having guests on who see talent from a very broad purview, who kind of see the same movie over and over and over, and can bring that expertise to the show. And I think you're going to get a ton out of the next 20 minutes because Rick Heitzmann is partner at Firstmark. Now, Firstmark, the VC fund that focuses on consumer, enterprise, media, ad tech, the list is endless, based in New York. Rick has led investments in StubHub. You've heard of StubHub. Riot Games. You've heard of Riot Games. First Advantage, Pinterest, the list is endless. Not only that, but he's been recognized multiple times as one of the top 100 VCs globally. So he's doing something right. He's going to share his wisdom about recruiting, retention, culture with us. How are you, Rick?
I'm great. Thanks for having me on. I've done a couple things right, not many.
I'll bet you've done more than a few.
No, it's been good so far, and I'm happy to be on, and I appreciate your invitation to join.
Why don't we start with just 60 seconds on Firstmark and kind of how big the fund is, how many portfolio companies, just so people kind of understand your investment thesis.
Sure. After being an entrepreneur at a high growth company, we founded, took public, and sold with a couple partners. I founded Firstmark about a dozen years ago, and we've kind of grown and scaled, mainly focused on the New York ecosystem to over $2 billion under management and about 100 different portfolio companies, as you mentioned, both in consumer as well as enterprise software and technology. And so, among those companies are companies like Shopify, who have tens of thousands of employees now, Pinterest with thousands of employees, Riot with thousands of employees, that when we got involved had a handful. And, Pinterest had 2 employees when we got involved. Riot had 4 or 5. So we've seen a lot of these multi-billion-dollar companies and how they've gone from an idea to the leading companies of our age. And we've been fortunate to partner with those entrepreneurs and have us along for the journey. But we believe the lifeblood of any great company is great people, and being able to find those people, recruit those people in, and then have them be successful is the most important thing to building world-class companies.
So let's start before an investment. You're thinking about getting involved with a company. Obviously, you check the box, product market fit. You check the box on market size, all those things. Differentiation. What is it about the people part of the business, the people part of the leaders, the culture, that makes you say, this is interesting versus run in the other direction?
First of all, they have to really understand the problem that they're trying to solve both today and tomorrow. So oftentimes for us at the earliest stages, it's a very personal problem. So Zach at Rowe, the founder CEO of Rowe Health and Roman, he had a very personal issue around ED and heart issues that made him say, hey, this is an issue that we should surface. And if it can help me, it can help other people.
They're not just looking to make money. They have a personal connection to the mission.
And they're very mission driven. And there's an old thing of, are your entrepreneurs missionaries or mercenaries? So are they missionaries who have a deep connection to the problem and therefore a deep empathy for those particular users? Or are they mercenaries who are able to find a market crease where they think they can make $1 and have taken advantage of it? And people have made money and founded good companies from both angles. Yep. We tend to like to work with the missionaries more just because they're deeper in the problem set. They understand the solution. They understand their audience. And they actually tend to have greater grit that they're going to be able to persist. And all of those companies I've mentioned had at least a few days where they thought, this might be a stupid company, we might go out of business. So in times where it might not seem to be logical to persist through that adversity to success, the more personal that mission is and the more tied you are to being a missionary, the more you're willing to push through and get to the next level.
I'm sure it's that way for founders and entrepreneurs. Same with the majority of the employees at these businesses, bring on, should they also be more connected to the mission than the money?
They should. And, usually the first, and it starts to fray once you get to about 100 employees. But, you want to have that owner or founder mindset, that you're passionate about the company, and you see, especially when you get to 100 people, not everybody's in every meeting.
Yeah.
And some people have a very segregated role and responsibility, but you want to be able to tie what you're doing and how that ties into the ultimate company mission. It's the old story when John F. Kennedy went down to Houston to check out NASA, and the early days of the space program. It was a complete mess. It was a lot of young guys trying to figure out how to get a rocket into outer space. And he shows up and they make him wait for 20 minutes. And he's like, this is crazy. I'm the president of the United States. You're making me wait. I don't understand what's going on here. I'm really mad. So he's wandering around, kicking things over. And then he walks over and he sees a guy who's picking up the trash there. And he said, hey, nice to meet you. I'm President Kennedy. What's your name? And his name was, John. Or he said, John, what are you doing here? He said, well, can't you see, sir, I'm putting a man on the moon. He said, what do you mean? He goes, well, my contribution as a janitor is helping free things up so we could put a man on the moon. And at that point, Kennedy stopped worrying about the culture and the small setbacks, knowing that culture will be able to overcome small setbacks and put people on the moon. And I think that's the type of early employee you want. And it seems to break at 100, but as long as you could push forward people who believe in that mission and put the company first, the stronger the culture is, and the better persistence you'll have.
So I guess the $1 million question then becomes, how do you sniff that out? So are there certain things that you've learned that you can share about how to know if the person is really wed to the mission genuinely, not just saying they are, or whether they're more the mercenary category?
I think there's probably two quite simple things of, how did you find the company and why do you like the company? And I know a lot of, especially consumer companies, always ask, well, how long have you been a user of our product? And because someone could show up and say, hey, this is my mission. I know this is my mission. I've always loved your company.
Right.
And then you ask them, how long have you been a subscriber? And they said, well, I've never really been to the website before. Like, well, right.
That's a red flag.
Yeah, it's a red flag. Or, how would you make our product better? And he said, well, another company of ours is helping to cure cancer. Well, when my mother had cancer and she was going through this, this would have been better as a caregiver and not only a user. And that's the kind of deeply empathetic to the customer base question. You could do it. The other thing that, is changing with the times, and all this is fluid, is, where have people worked historically and for how long? Is there...
And what are you looking for there specifically?
Is there a narrative and a thread? So do you have a deep passion about healthcare? And you might not have always worked in, digital healthcare, but you might have interned at a healthcare consultancy. You might have worked at a form of healthcare. You might have been interested in a certain piece of something, or even majored in college. Is there something that you're in the old school resume, now your LinkedIn, ties to what you're saying, that you're showing, a greater interest than someone who might have perused the website?
You also mentioned how long they've been there. What do you think about someone that on the surface seems competent, but they love startups and they've been at 5 startups for a year each just because those companies didn't make it, maybe no fault of their own? How do you assess and weigh that?
5 in 5 years is a lot, but we know that some startups don't make it, and depending on if they were CEO of 5 straight startups didn't make it,
that's a good point.
One thing.
Yep.
But if you're a developer or early on, you might be telling you something else. So we like people who've had both success and failures, who've seen adversity. There's great companies like Google, and people have spent their career there, but there's people who've been at Google for a long time who've never had to really face adversity. And how is that going to look when they have to face them? So you want teams that are balanced with people who might have a chip on their shoulder from companies that didn't go as well as people who might be used to winning scale and growth and having those be with each other. And there's also a bit of a thread of, hey, I've been with 3 companies in the last 6 years, but
Hey, Rick, I've lost you. I don't know if you can hear me.
recruited away to a next level or a different place. I can hear you.
Okay.
The video paused for a second.
Okay, you got me. Great.
Yeah.
So what have you learned about the size of these founding teams or co-founders? Right. I know there's no right number, but you've been at this for a dozen years or more. What have you found to be the right mix?
So we like teams that we like to have 2 people, just because founding a company or even being a CEO is a very lonely job. There's the famous, like, nobody cares really what you're doing. The Ben Horowitz piece, which is great.
Yep.
It says no one really cares. It's your job to handle all the problems. And especially, as either a young person or someone who's trying to do something that's never been done before, it's helpful to have somebody who's going on the journey with you.
Is that a requirement? Would you
It's
not invest in a company with one founder?
No, we would do that. We would invest with one founder. We've done some things, especially serial entrepreneurs. It's easier for them to persist because they know the playbook a little bit.
Got it.
And then we generally find if you have 4 or more founders, it gets complex in the medium term because not all of those founders are going to persist. So how does that work over time? That, especially if we would call it the peanut butter cap table, where you're just spreading,
Sure.
You're taking the founder shares, everyone gets a 6th. And then you look around 5 years later and only 2 founders are there, and one's the CEO and one has a director level job. The CEO is going to feel like it's a bit unfair that people who might have been in their dorm room at the time of inception are being treated the same way as someone else, and a director level person might have the same level equity as he does, or she does as the CEO. And so you want to make sure that you're not diluting yourself too much out of the box.
Got it. How do you you mentioned an interesting stat, Rick. You said at 100 people is where these things start to come off the rails on the people perspective. What are the telltale signs? What have you smelled that tells you the culture is heading in the wrong direction? You gave a great example of John F. Kennedy. I'm also interested in kind of what you've seen at some of these companies, whether you invested or not.
By the way, so you're seeing equity, from what I could see from maybe a quantitative and director perspective, that it's taking you longer or harder to hire people because there aren't systems in place. Usually around 100 people, you want to hire a head of people. And that might not be traditionally, especially in high growth companies, is not the HR or the administrative function of human capital, but it's more human capital acquisition, so recruiting, as well as managing processes, especially for your best people. So, at that point, the CEO probably doesn't know all the employees. They're probably starting to be less mission driven and less part of a small group of, your SEAL Team 6 trying to finish a mission. And it's becoming more of a segmentation. Jobs become much more defined. And therefore, you have to have systems in place. And if those systems aren't in place and the right culture is not in place, you find people doing things that are not accretive. And one of the ways that comes out is it's taking you longer or costing you more to hire people than you might see in a normal environment, or it might be different than what you might see in the benchmarks.
I assume it's harder. You're seeing that it's harder now than ever before.
Yes. And I would say it's probably gotten a bit easier for the best companies in the last 6 months or so. I think, in a broad sense, as the market hit some chops in the fourth quarter of last year, I think potential employees were beginning to see a flight to quality. So companies that are profitable, that are fully financed, that are growing very quickly, that have a lot of momentum. We're seeing an uptick in resumes, and companies that didn't have some of those dynamics, we're seeing a downtick.
Are there certain things you look for in those resumes? And we talked earlier about what companies they've been at and industry interest, but are there certain DNA that you have found that you should look for across all these companies, or does each company have its own unique DNA? And the key is really to find people who match that particular company's DNA. I guess I'm
I think it's
interested
more
in
the
if whether
latter
they're
than the former.
universal DNA.
Yeah, there's not a universal DNA. And when we think about it, and we go through all our companies and they report and open recs every Monday, and everybody wanted the same people, would be awful hard. No different than if everyone wanted to marry the same man or woman, and wouldn't be as easy. But there's a lid for every pot, and every culture is unique, and every skill set's unique, and every stage that company's at is unique. So you're looking for a unique person for that. There's some universalisms. We do like people who've stuck with companies and haven't jumped around as much by their own volition. And people who have, it's not rocket science. People who have stuck at a company and have continued to be promoted.
Right.
And they've been continued to be promoted due to their success and the company's success.
Right. It's not a coincidence.
They're growing and scaling in a growing, scaling organization. And then there's a bunch of other elements of that. If they're growing and scaling, they might have started off as a salesperson and then wound up, 5 years later as the global head of revenue. They've obviously done a lot of things right. They've obviously figured out some things, and they've obviously built a team underneath them that has followed them. So if we wanted to recruit that person away to be the global head of revenue at one of our companies, you'd probably bet they have U.S. head of sales or East Coast divisional lead of sales who would probably follow them. It shows leadership, it shows confidence, and it shows maybe the ability to scale even at a young age.
Got it. One last question that I'd like to touch on is, a story about the worst hire that you've ever made or that you've seen a CEO make, and we're not going to name names, but what was the issue and what might have you identified earlier that could have been a yellow flag that there was a problem? And the reason is these bad hires are so hard to identify. It's easy after the fact. So I'm curious if there's one that comes to mind that you still kick yourself for and you say, oh, if only I had looked at X.
Yeah, I'll take one from my own past as an entrepreneur where I got, there was someone who showed up for a job that was almost too good to be true. And, they went to great schools and they had great experience and they were incredibly polished and their references spoke very highly of them. So it was like, oh, this person's great. And they were willing to take the job as presented at the compensation level as presented, which felt like it was a little bit below them. And, you thought, wow, you're hiring a rock star that's willing to come to this company because the company's great and I'm great and they're willing to take less compensation. And, just because you believe you're over hiring, that individual wasn't very successful, and I think probably lasted in a time period measured by months or weeks, that they thought they were very senior, and although they said they were a doer, one of the telltale signs of hiring someone who says they're a doer and then day one needs to hire a bunch of people to do the doing, especially as a startup. We like people who could go high-low and could have a high-level conversation, but then could go and execute themselves against that. And this guy clearly wasn't that. And then, very quickly also came back and said, I was willing to take the comp as offered, but upon thinking about it, I actually am making a lot less than my last job. Can I get a raise? And that was about a month into the job. Mm. So, we were hiring someone who you thought was way too good for the job. And like a lot of things that are too good to be true, it was proven too good to be true in that he really didn't want this job. He really wanted a much better job. And he thought he was going to be able to talk himself into that. So when somebody seems overqualified, be, really drill down into when you show up at work, this is what's going to, as a doer, this is what you're going to do. You're not going to have your staff and dole out responsibilities and go to Starbucks. You are going to be doing these things in PowerPoint, in Keynote, in Excel, and we expect for these things to happen. We are on an annual performance review cycle, and if you excel, you will be eligible for additional equity or additional salary. We're not going to review your compensation because you'd like to get paid more. So as a young manager, I was over enthralled by someone's historical title and maybe where they went to school, and let that kind of blow me away instead of thinking about, here's the job that I have today. I need to find somebody who's going to be very excited to do that job today.
Yeah.
I later, after he left, was able to hire somebody who was significantly less experienced.
In terms of number of years experience?
In number of years experience or even the level of experience, but had a desire to really prove something and grow into the role.
Yeah.
And therefore was able to stay in that role and be very granular, be a doer, and earn their way into a very senior role in a short period of time. So I always prefer to bet on young people willing to work hard and bet on themselves than somebody who might seem great because they historically had a fancy title.
Yeah, the up and comer, so to speak. It's so common that I hear that people overhire. They think it's a shortcut, right? I'll hire someone who's been there, done that, but
they're great. They were the president of a fancy company. They ran this division at a Fortune 50 company where they had some massive number of employees, and that's a big thing I always talk about with startups. So I said, this is John. He used to run 14,000 people at Bank 101, and he said, well, we only have 100 people here, and that job seems very, very different of being a president of a 14,000 person company, being a president of a 100-person company, and the entire job is actually completely different. And therefore, the scale of his job and the types of things he did are actually completely irrelevant. So don't fall in love with big, Fortune 20 name, because it's actually a negative signal.
I couldn't agree more. I've made that mistake myself, and I've seen many very smart leaders make the same mistake. They forget that the role is different, right? With each order of magnitude, are you managing 2 people or 20 people or 200 people? You spend your days differently in those situations. Well, Rick, I can't thank you enough for making time. How can people learn more about Firstmark or get in touch?
Sure. So the easiest way is our website, www. Follow us on Twitter, and then we have a newsletter for both job opportunities as well as just keeping you in the loop. So we're happy to have as many people get involved as possible, and we have a series of conferences we run in the Driven series of code-driven, data-driven, design-driven, and hardwired that you can read a lot more on. It's a way to really build a community around things you're passionate about in tech, especially in the New York City market.
Great. And again, that website again is
Firstmark Cap, FIRSTMARKCAP, as in firstmarkcapital.com.
Terrific. Thanks again, Rick. We appreciate you making the time.
Thanks, Jeff. Talk to you soon.